DC. Claudia, welcome.
Thank you.
So the focus of our program today is U.S.-China nuclear dynamics, and we're so grateful to have Dr. Santoro's expertise as well as Claudia's expertise. David, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background and how you got involved in studying these issues?
Okay. Well, I've been working on nuclear/WMD weapons of mass destruction issues for the past 10 years now, and I'm originally from Europe, so I used to sort of focus on Europe. And I spent some time in Australia, so I ended up working more on Asia, and now being based in Hawaii. This is a big focus of what we do at Pacific Forum, has to do with East Asian security issues. So I've sort of been working on Asian security and nuclear issues with a focus on China.
All right, and Claudia, you are currently a Fulbright Fellow and a doctoral candidate at Tsinghua University. What are you writing your dissertation on?
I'm writing my dissertation on the stability-instability paradox. What it basically is a concept taken from the Cold War that says once two countries have basically achieved some level of nuclear parity, that on the conventional level there could be more instability.
Okay, that sounds really interesting, and it sounds like you guys are really the right guests to be talking us through U.S.-China nuclear dynamics today. So again, thank you both so much for joining us. So there were several documents that were released recently regarding nuclear dynamics, and the first one that we'll be discussing now is the annual Department of Defense report. So David, would you mind sharing a little bit about what this report is about and why it's important?
Right. Well, it's a report that has been, so it's an annual report that is released, has been released since the early 2000s by the Pentagon, as you said, the U.S. Department of Defense. And this is an assessment of China's military development, which includes nuclear, but it is not limited to nuclear dynamics. And so it's an annual assessment of how China's military modernization is proceeding. So it's been going on since the early 2000s, arguably because China has been the least transparent of the so-called nuclear weapon states, and therefore there was some kind of a need in the U.S. government of trying to explain where China was going in terms of its military program.
And this is a free report to read online, so anyone can go online and read this report.
Absolutely.
It was released last month.
Last month, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was there anything in this defense report that was interesting or new or anything that was noteworthy about it?
So what grabbed the attention of the media was the fact that China was mentioned by the report as directly attacking U.S. interests in cyberspace, and that was in a way a first because China was directly mentioned as conducting cyber attacks or activities against U.S. interests. So that was the focus of how the media actually sort of looked at the report.
And Claudia, would you be able to weigh in on how that was received in China?
Well, there are basically two sentiments. The first one is that China understands there's a classified version of the report and there's a non-classified version of the report. So the one that public can access is the non-classified version. And
Yes.
this one tends to be tailored towards the defense industry and conservatives so that you can appeal for probably more budget for defense. And another sentiment behind it is that it's exaggerated because a lot of the sources that provided for this report come from China's online military forum, which is usually very nationalistic and very and a little bit optimistic in terms of capabilities. So there's questions about the reliability of the report, and also whether this hyper threat of China's capabilities is really real because of the sources that it comes from.
Okay.
Just to build upon this, and I should have probably said that earlier, is this report has been pretty much hated by China ever since it got released because it's assessing China and singling out, allegedly singling out China and the fact that it's doing military development. So the fact that China that there's that the report hasn't been well received, the recent report, is not really a surprise. It's probably particularly not surprising now that China is being named as conducting, as I said, cyberspace activity against the United States. But over the years, every time the report has been released, it hasn't actually been seen favorably by Beijing.
So did the report mention anything at all about nuclear weapons or China's nuclear arsenal?
It's mentioned about, it did mention what China has been doing in terms of developing ballistic missiles and a range of other developments as well. The element, again, that grabbed the media's attention was the concern about the so-called ambiguity regarding no first use, which is the pledge that China will never be the first country to use nuclear weapons. And so the report highlights the fact that there have been some discussions or an increasing number of ambiguity as to whether China was sticking with this policy.
So this idea of no first use, I believe that was also mentioned recently in the Chinese white paper as well. Claudia, can you explain to me what that Chinese white paper is about regarding defense?
Basically, China has been publishing this defense white paper to outline China's nuclear strategy and doctrine, military strategy and doctrine. And this year has been particularly important because China also outlined the number of the military personnel we have, and even given the full name of the military organization, military command zone. So this has been a progress, but there was a lot of suspicion that China was backing down on the no first use pledge, because in the defense white paper, whereas before it has always mentioned that China will adhere to the no first use policy, in this year's report, it did not appear in the defense white paper.
So this is a big deal.
It is and it isn't. I would be, among the people who would say it isn't, because the language was there explaining that China still adheres to a no first use policy. The one thing that was missing is the term no first use, that China was still adhering to no first use. But otherwise, the explanations as to how China was doing its nuclear policy is still consistent with what you would call no first use. Now, at the same time, although no first use was not mentioned in the white paper, there was a big non-proliferation treaty conference in Geneva going on around the same time, and the Chinese representative actually made a clear statement that China was still adhering to its no first use policy. So this is to sort of put some context into it. So it was not mentioned in the document, but it was mentioned by the Chinese representative at the NPT preparatory committee meeting.
Okay. So Claudia, do you agree with David's analysis in that the omission of the term no first use is not as alarming as one might think?
Yes, I actually went back to check because there were some analysts who claims that whereas before China has stated China is adhering to the no first use policy, whereas in the statement this year in the non-proliferation review conference in Geneva, it says China has adhered to. But when I went back to the Chinese translation, it actually says that China has adhered from the they use the term 始终, which means has been always. So I think China's policy on this has not been changed.
Now, at the same time, and I guess we can discuss this as well, is no first use is a declaratory policy. So, I mean, not that it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter if when you're doing strategy. Like, I doubt that there's any American strategist that would base its military planning on what Chinese says it will or will not do. It certainly matters what you say, but what matters more is what you do. So no first use is to be taken with a grain of salt, I would argue. I don't know what, Claudia, what you think of this. I mean, I think it's important, but at the same time, I wouldn't think that this is the main thing that we should be focusing on.
Well, on that point, David, you're right. This is a declaratory policy, but the no first use pledge is important because it's one of the things that when it's there, sometimes people doubt that whether China is, whether it has content in it. But if suddenly China does not, if suddenly this policy disappeared, then it shifts. It says a lot about the changes of China's nuclear strategy. So the no first use policy is a very good thing while it is there, and I think people should recognize that even though this is a declaratory policy, but it matches with the rest of the things that China is doing. For example, our nuclear warhead and our missiles are demated, so it takes sometimes hours to days to match them together. So in a real conflict situation, this means China is unlikely to attack first. So this is a good thing, even though it's a declaratory policy. It might have more content than people think.
I agree. I mean, so sorry.
No, please continue.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I'm not saying it's meaningless in terms of, I mean, I think it matters if China suddenly said, we're not adhering to this pledge anymore, because, the US and others would start to worry about why is China suddenly not, or changing this policy? What does that mean for Chinese forces? Now, what I'm saying, however, what I'm saying is that I don't think that the United States is basing its strategy according to that particular pledge. And I mean, again, what matters is what you do more than what you say, and that's true in human relations as well.
Claudia, did you want to respond to that?
Well, yes, I think you have a good point there, David. But one of the things that is good to have this kind of policy is also that that for nuclear, for a long time, China has this very low alert status in terms of its nuclear deployment. So it sends a lot of reassurance to itself and to overseas, because the chances for China's accidental launch is minimum. That the United States doesn't have to worry that China might accidentally launch its nuclear weapon. Whereas this does not, whereas it's not the same the otherwise. The United States have a launch-on warning status, which is not specifically targeted at China, not specifically, but there is the potential risk of accidental launch. So to have low alert status for both strategic forces could be a good thing, and for that, that could be the first step, even if it's not a no first use.
So regarding the no first use policy, is that a policy that's really set in stone? What does no first use really mean? I mean, the name is quite self-evident, but is that what it means in practice? Does it mean that China has a commitment to never, in all circumstances, use a nuclear weapon first? Is that what the policy means?
Claudia, did you want to jump in? No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Now, this is the thing that I think is causing some debate in China as well. Some of the American analysts come to China and they want to question the credibility of no first use. So they come up with questions saying, hey, if we use conventional weapons to attack the Three Gorges Dam, are you not going to use nuclear weapons to retaliate? If we use conventional weapons to attack your leadership, are you not going to use nuclear weapons? So these questions, they wanted to ask this question so that China's credibility behind no first use policy could be shaken. But it's not a good thing that they ask these questions, because it doesn't make sense, because they won't happen. On the other hand, it sends a very hostile signal to China. So it's better that China have a no first use policy, and China is not changing this policy. This is a good thing. I think the Americans should try to believe that, and Americans should try to accept that as a policy instead of doubt it.
I'm sorry?
Yes, I think this policy should be recognized and appreciated instead of being doubted or questioned.
Right. Well, I mean, and another thing as well is, I don't think, and that's why I'm doubting that, China is changing its policy. I don't think China has any advantage of suddenly saying, no, suddenly we're not following the no first use pledge, because I don't think it would have anything to gain by saying this. So whether or not we believe it is one important question, but another important question is, what's in it for China? Why would it suddenly change its policy? I don't know what you think, Claudia.
I'm just going to stop you right there. Just for any viewers who are just joining us right now, this is Asia in Review. I'm your host, Ellise Akazawa, and our guests today are Dr. David Santoro, who's joining us in studio, and Claudia He, who is joining us by phone from Washington, D.C. And what we're talking about right now is China's no first use policy regarding nuclear weapons. So feel free to just jump back in. And Claudia, did you want to respond to David's point?
Sorry, I missed David's point. Can you restate your point?
Got to remember my point now.
I know.
What was I saying?
Let me just jump in with a question first that sort of tails into what you were saying earlier. What would prompt China to have a change in its no first use policy? Would there be any circumstances in which China would feel a need to sort of change that pledge?
I don't think it's a good question to ask. What's the point of asking this question?
I'm guessing just to give our viewers an idea of, if this is the current policy in China right now, is there anything that might change that in the future?
I think it's very hard to say. A lot of that depends on domestic development instead of international development. I know there are people who think that China should somehow change this policy, and there are other people who support this policy. So I think it depends more on the domestic factors than other circumstances. But one of the reasons could trigger some changes in China's nuclear policy would be the development of the precision-guided weapons. Because China has such a limited number of nuclear weapons, it's possible that the United States could eliminate China's nuclear weapons by using its precision-guided conventional weapons. America doesn't have this capability now, but it might have in the future. So under these kind of circumstances, China might feel either to increase the survivability of its nuclear weapons, which it is doing now, or change its nuclear doctrine or alert status. So that could be one of the factors that will affect the future of China's nuclear strategy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you're right that there are domestic factors that would come into play. I think it's worth remembering as well that Russia, during the Cold War, had a no first use policy and eventually gave it up at the end of the Cold War because nuclear weapons became so much more of a necessity to rely on for Moscow, and therefore I was going to say, but you mentioned the international factors as well, that exterior factors or non-domestic factors matter in how you shape your doctrine or policy. But I mean, you did mention that this could also impact China's decision to possibly change its no first use policy.
So regarding other countries, are there other countries that are nuclear powers that also have a no first use policy as well, or is China the only one?
China technically is the most vocal one about having a no first use policy. Now at the same time, sorry.
North Korea has a no first use policy as well, but I don't know whether we should believe it or not. Well,
the same question actually arises. I mean, it's And then that's when political factors, come into play. Do you have to believe what you're being told? Again, it's a policy. So, it comes down to whether you want to trust or believe whatever you hear. So I mean, it's a big problem. I'm not sure it matters too much, and I'm not sure. I know there's a lot of discussions around no first use. I'm not sure that this is the main topic that we should be focusing on. And again, one thing that I wanted to add as well: not having a no first use policy doesn't mean that you have a first use policy. It just means that
That's
you're not.
an important distinction.
You're not specific about the way you would use nuclear weapons. I'm just saying this because the United States does not have a no first use policy, and often it's been either misinterpreted or suggested by sometimes China that this means the U.S. had a first use policy, and it doesn't. It just means that the U.S. is not prepared to say that it has a no first use policy.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, continue, Claudia.
Yeah, David, I agree with you. Having no first use policy doesn't mean that it's a first use policy. I think the United States is moving towards that direction. Right now, it doesn't have a no first use policy, but I think it's moving towards the direction of sole purpose that basically says we'll only use nuclear weapons against countries that possess WMD, so biological, chemical, and nuclear, and this is moving towards the direction of sole purpose, which is a little bit less than no first use, but still a big progress, as stated in the nuclear posture review.
Right. Actually, the nuclear posture review says that the United States does not need to use nuclear weapons against biological and chemical weapons, but reserves the right to change its policy depending on the evolution of biological proliferation. So it's even saying that it's only against nuclear and biological and chemical weapons are not technically, do not have to be included. So I mean, it is moving in this direction. I agree with you, Claudia. That's correct.
So we've talked a lot about the no first use policy, but there are so many other facets to the U.S.-China nuclear relationship. What are some other areas or major issue areas for this relationship?
Claudia, did you want to start? I think another area is of course the concerns over. I think for the United States, you are concerned about China's nuclear submarine force and the modernization of China's nuclear forces. And for China, we are also concerned about the missile defense system, how it might affect our deterrence. So these are also the concerns for both sides.
Right, and I think that's correct. Now, the United States is always pushing for China to be more transparent about its force modernization, as we've mentioned earlier. That's one of the main purpose of this report, because arguably China is not transparent enough. Therefore, the DoD needs to put out a report that sort of explains what's out there and where China is going. But beyond capabilities, there are things that we've been discussing in the meeting that we had in January. So it's the U.S.-China Strategic Nuclear Dynamics meeting at the Track 1.5 level.
And Claudia, you were in attendance at this meeting with David as well, right?
Yes, I was there with David.
Okay.
Right, and in this meeting, we tackled a range of new topics that would help enhance U.S.-China relationships at the nuclear level, like issues like crisis management, non-proliferation, how to move forward on nuclear arms controls. All these areas, and there are others as well, where we can actually make progress, the two countries can actually make progress together without actually focusing on things that are, the toughest issues about transparency and force modernization and the like. So there are a range of issues that we can talk about and need to be addressed to enhance stability and also, promote cooperation in other countries.
And Claudia, do you agree with David?
Yeah, one of the themes of that conference was how to carry out mutual strategic reassurance. So reassurance on the strategic level means in nuclear, in space, and in cyber. And I think the Pacific Forum CSIS, along with some of the other participants of the conference, has also produced a report about how to conduct mutual strategic reassurance between the two countries. Am I right, David?
And that's correct, yes.
And the report will be released this week or next week?
That's actually the report of the conference. I think the report that Claudia is referring to is a report conducted by us at Pacific Forum, SAIC, and CAGDA, is that right, Claudia? I can't remember the Chinese think tank that did the report. I think it was CAGDA, the China Arms Control and Disarmament Association. And it's a report that we published, I believe, in January, and that it's called Building Towards a Stable and Cooperative U.S.-China Nuclear Relations. And so it's meant to, as Claudia mentioned, try to find all these areas where they can be mutual, reassurance, cooperation between the U.S. and China.
And that goes back to what you were saying about there's no need to necessarily tackle the toughest issues first, but there are lots of areas of common interest that we can really work on strengthening.
Absolutely. One of them is non-proliferation. Like, I know Claudia has an interest in North Korea. North Korea is the perfect case where technically the U.S. and China could cooperate to encourage North Korea to give up, its nuclear ambitions. So that's one area where there's work to be done. And at our meeting, we discussed it and realized that there are things we could do, but that the U.S. and China and the Chinese don't always agree on how we should do it. I don't know what your take is on non-proliferation, Claudia, but that's an area which I think we should probably talk a little bit more.
Yes, and also there was agreement that more dialogues should be conducted between the two countries, more talks, and also to just understand what reassurance means for both countries, because it could mean different things. Whereas it's the United States concerned about China's transparency, China has concern over U.S. missile defense, conventional capabilities as well. So this conference recognized the fact that both sides need to talk in order to reassure each other, in order to reduce misunderstandings and lessen mutual uncertainties. I think this is very important. That is the uncertainty that we have towards each other. That is something that we really need to work on.
Claudia, I have a question specifically for you about this call for greater transparency in China. So I imagine that many people could argue China is a sovereign state and it doesn't need to be more transparent about nuclear weapons that it does or doesn't have. How do Chinese feel about the calls for greater transparency regarding China's nuclear program?
Well, China's nuclear strategy is one that's based on minimum deterrence. That is, we have a very, very small nuclear arsenal compared to the United States and Russia. Because of that, we wanted to the sort of opaqueness or a lack of transparency is a way to protect our nuclear arsenal. Because in order to to increase the survivability of our nuclear arsenal, some sort of opaqueness will be helpful. And that's why it's difficult for China to come out and say, hey, we have this number, because our number is very small. Whereas for the United States and Russia, you can survive with big numbers, huge numbers. China is not doing that. China is keeping low numbers. And so some level of opaqueness can help with the survivability of our nuclear arsenal and for the deterrence effect.
I know you're not a U.S. citizen, but would you be able to provide a U.S. perspective on those arguments?
Yeah, and actually a little pushback on what Claudia's just said. I hope you're not going to be mad, Claudia. You mentioned about the fact that China has a small arsenal and therefore needs to be, opaque or not as transparent as the others. Now, just to remind you, like the French, the British also have a very small arsenal, and are quite transparent about their forces, and therefore the fact that China has a small arsenal shouldn't matter as much. And again, I don't think that the United States, and this is to answer your question, is asking for either a ceiling or a specific number, but more information as to where China is going and what it wants to do exactly, because there's a level, relatively high level of frustration about, where China is going in terms of capabilities and to do what exactly.
Well, David, I agree with you that Britain and France also have low numbers, but don't forget they are also under the U.S. nuclear umbrella as well. So when you count the numbers of French and British nuclear arsenals, you cannot count them individually. Whereas in China, these are the numbers that, these are the nuclear arsenals we have. But on the other hand, I do not disagree with you that there is a process towards becoming more transparent, but this process have to be reciprocal. That is that while we become more transparent with our numbers. Actually, with this, let me state one more thing. This process is also a domestic process as well. That is, more and more people want to know that how many numbers that we have, and this is a domestic process as well as a response towards international requests. It's also domestic requests as well. When people become more when people want to know more about this information, then probably more information will come out. But on the other hand, China will move towards that process. But some of the concerns that China has to be addressed as well by the United States, so that we can feel more reassured to becoming more transparent. For example, your missile defense system, your conventional precision guided weapons. These are some things that will hold China back from becoming more transparent. Because if you have more capabilities that can strike China's nuclear weapons once you know the numbers, this could be very critical for China's deterrence. So I think it's a step that we should both work together, that if you want to impose a request, you should be able to accept a restraint as well. So I think it's the area that both the United States and China should work on.
I'm just going to pause you right there, and I think we're going to bring it back down for just a minute to the local Honolulu level. We have an announcement, I believe, from Jay Fidel from ThinkTech Hawaii, who wanted to let us know about a program that's going to be happening this Thursday. Jay.
Indeed, I did. Thank you very much, Ellise. Thank you for the time. I wanted to talk about a program called Housing in Hawaii, Waking Up to the American Dream at a Price We Hope We Can Afford. This is on May 23rd, Thursday. It starts at 11:30 a.m. in the Plaza Club. It features our opening speaker, Paul Brubaker, who is an economist and provocateur, Harry Saunders, who is the president of Castle & Cook Hawaii, as our moderator. And our panelists are Stanford Carr, a Hawaii developer, Tony Ching, executive director of the Hawaii Community Development Authority, which runs Kaka'ako, Paul Kay of Kamehameha Schools, which owns a lot of land in Kaka'ako and has big plans there, Nick Vanderboom, who is likewise with with the Howard Hughes Corporation that owns a lot of land in Kaka'ako and has big plans there. John Wallenstrom, who runs Forest City, Hawaii, a big developer, and John White with the Carpenters Union, Pacific Resource Properties, which is always very concerned about union labor involved in these projects. Billions of dollars of housing among these very panelists. And as housing goes, you know, Ellise, so goes Hawaii. So if anyone wants to come to that, sign up on hvca.org. Can I have a minute more?
Sure, absolutely. And by the way, that sounds like a really all-star lineup of panelists. It's going to be a great event.
It is, and we're running very high on sign-ups. It's very crowded already. So if anybody wants to come, they ought to sign up right away. It's only 2 days away. Our program in June, on June 27th, another Thursday, 11:30 a.m. at the Plaza Club, is Healthcare in Hawaii. And the subtitle is, If You Think It's Expensive Now, Wait Till You See What Happens. We're not kidding. The moderator is Virginia Pressler, Executive Vice President of Hawaii Pacific Health, which runs Kapiolani and Palimomi, and half a dozen panelists on that program also of the same ilk. Healthcare is the most important thing. And as healthcare goes, so goes Hawaii. If we don't care about our own health and our health systems, who will? A great state deserves great health care. Sign up on hvca.org. Hope to see you there also, Ellise and David.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay. And again, if you're just joining us, this is Asia in Review, and we're talking about U.S.-China nuclear dynamics. It's some pretty intense stuff.
That's right.
My guest today is Dr. David Santoro, who's joining us in studio. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Claudia He, who is joining us via phone from Washington, D.C. Claudia, thanks again for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So before we jump back in to start talking about some more of the issues in the U.S.-China nuclear relationship, what kind of forums are available in an official state-to-state capacity between the U.S. and China to talk about these nuclear issues? Are they just sidelined discussions that already happen, or is there a specific forum, a specific conference where these issues are dealt with?
So you've just stolen exactly what I was going to respond to Claudia. We don't have an official nuclear dialogue between the United States and China, and I fully agree with what Claudia said. That we need to discuss, we need to explore areas where we can cooperate. We need to talk more about what transparency means for China, for the U.S., how we move forward on this, and also in missile defense and other areas. But the start for this would be to have an official dialogue, and I believe the United States has been pushing to go to track 1. Right now we have a track 1.5 dialogue, which is a non-official dialogue involving people from the government, but essentially being a non-official dialogue that we at Pacific Forum run in Beijing every year.
And all of these are off the record and people are in their private capacities?
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. But we need to actually go to track 1 and have that official discussion to talk about all the wonderful things that the United States and China could do together.
So with that, Claudia, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I agree with David at the point we don't have a track 1 dialogue with regard to nuclear issues. However, I want to emphasize the importance of these track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues, because in these dialogues we have experts, we have academics, we also have people from the government present at these meetings. So it's a less formal way to communicate freely about what we think, our mutual concerns and our uncertainties. So even though we don't have a track 1 dialogue, there is great value in these track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues. And I think we should both work on that for these dialogues to continue.
Absolutely.
I think that's right. I think I fully agree that they are hugely valuable, and particularly over time you build a process and the familiarity among participants, and you're able to actually achieve a lot. I don't think that they should be seen as a replacement to track one. I mean, nothing's going to replace track one discussions, official discussions. So we should really see them as stepping stones towards official level discussions. So they are great and they should be continued, but they are a stepping stone to something more official.
Claudia, do you think that track one dialogues will be a next step in the relationship?
Well, I actually happen to believe that these track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues have more values in communicating concerns, because in most of the track 1 dialogues, it tends to be very formal, and people probably won't be able to talk as freely as they can in these 1.5 and track 2 dialogues. So I actually place more importance on track 2 and track 1.5.
I mean, I think the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, the Pacific Forum has been running extended deterrence dialogues with the Japanese and the Koreans for a long time, and then when formal extended deterrence dialogues were set up at the official level, a lot has been done, and our track 2, track 1.5 dialogues have continued because they've acted as support to the official dialogues. So, these track 2, track 1.5 dialogues can be not only a stepping stone, but also a means to facilitate official discussions. I don't think that anything is going to replace official discussions or, the two governments to discuss among each other. Yes, they're going to be more formal. Yes, they're going to be more talking points than the kind of casual discussions that we have at the track 1 level, but really this is how we're going to get things done more concretely.
So what about in the wider policy community? Does there seem to be a movement leaning more towards eventually there will be track 1 official on the record dialogues between the US and China, or are those discussions not happening?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that behind the scenes, things are being said, but again, you need that process. Particularly for countries as important as US and China, to be talking to each other and to be sort of addressing all these issues that are very complicated and that need to be talked out. I think on the margin of some official discussions that the US and China have on other areas, some of these issues are being addressed, but I believe that we need an official dialogue to specifically focused on nuclear issues.
Claudia, do you want to respond to that?
I agree with you. Sorry about that.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yes, I was just saying, David, I agree with you. And also remember, today the people at track 2 and track 1.5 dialogue might be those key decision makers for the future. So
right.
One of the values, even if we can't have track 1 dialogue today, one of the values that we have with track 2 and track 1.5 is that for junior experts or junior policymakers to meet and to know each other for a better future, for less uncertainty in the future. So all of these dialogues will lead to a closer relationship in the future if we start right now and continue.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe we should mention the Young Leaders Program.
Absolutely. So Pacific Forum does run a Young Leaders Program, and that's its signature next generation effort. And it's not really for people who are new to the field. It's for people like, in many cases, David and Claudia, who represent some of the more experienced participants. But it's really for young and emerging experts in the field to get to know the key decision makers in the region. And really, I think what is most important, and you, David and Claudia, can speak to this really well, it's about building peer networks. Getting to know who your counterparts are in other countries, and getting to know and building a relationship of trust with the people that you're going to be calling. Exactly.
I think it's priceless. I mean, to me, I think I first started in 2006 my relationship with the Young Leaders Program, and it's been hugely helpful. Yeah, 2006. I feel like I'm old now, but it's been hugely helpful. And these dialogues that we do are, yes, among seniors, but also less senior people, and what you've mentioned, Claudia, is totally right.
And Claudia, what has your experience in the Young Leaders Program been like? Participating in these track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues, you seem to speak very highly of them. Has your experience been really positive in these programs? Have you learned a lot?
Yeah, I've learned a lot from colleagues like David and other American colleagues as well. We come from very different worlds, but the Young Leaders Program provided a platform for we to know each other, to understand each other better, but also to engage with senior policymakers. So it's not just building network for the future. You're also building network for the present to lead to the future. So these are very, very precious opportunities for anybody who can be involved in programs like this.
So how would you describe the current state of the U.S.-China relationship? Because I feel there's a lot of fear-mongering in the U.S., the rise of China, that China is very threatening. But considering that you both are pretty well entrenched in the community and you have a really good understanding of the issues, would you say that the relationship that the U.S. and China share now regarding nuclear dynamics is significantly evolved from where it was maybe 5 years ago?
I would say if you take the long view, yes, we've made a lot of progress. And on many areas. Even when it comes to transparency, I mean, you have to admit that China has been increasingly transparent. In I would say all accounts. Now, I mean, I don't think it's enough, but I think it's there has been a lot of things done. China's been more transparent. In terms of the past couple of years, maybe a year, I mean, we've seen tensions emerging, and this is due to a range of issues in the South and East China Seas, and also China's perception of how the United States is re-engaging or re-engaging its allies. So on the whole, my answer would be yes, we've made progress. But I mean, if you look at current events and what's going on, then there's definitely levels of tensions.
And Claudia, do you agree with that, or do you see it differently?
Yes. Well, clearly I know David long enough now. I think our consensus is more than our differences. But I also wanted to say that nuclear relations is just one part of our larger relations. I would like to use, I usually use the example to demonstrate the nuclear relations between the two countries.
Okay.
I used to ask my colleagues, is it possible for, if the United States move all its people and all its banks to China, if under that kind of circumstance, would it be possible for America to strike China with nuclear weapons? And the answer is not, because if the states do that, then all its people and all its money will be destroyed, right? But they will not quite come close to that situation yet. But there are a lot of Americans in China. There are a lot of American investments in China. We are in a mutual dependent relations. Whether or not we have a mutual assured destruction, the sort of mad relations that the United States have with Russia. So because of the very close economic ties, that there is, I don't think there is real nuclear threat between these two countries. And that's why we should talk about each other's concerns more, because what the real threat is probably not each other. It's probably things that we cannot control. For example, like accidental nuclear launch or our perceived nuclear threat from the other side. So this is my take in the mutual relationship.
I think that's right. I mean, I agree. Maybe you and I should start that dialogue, that official dialogue.
We should do it together, David.
Claudia, one of the things that I had wanted to ask you from a Chinese perspective is, again, going back to this fear-mongering in the United States about China, and a lot of people feel very threatened by China's rise, is if China seeks to grow its nuclear arsenal, or as China seeks to really modernize its military, do you feel in a sense that it's almost unfair that if China wants to grow, it should be allowed to grow and people shouldn't be allowed to say anything against that? Does China ever feel bullied?
Well, I think grow is a word. China is growing and China is rising, but China does have a legitimate claim to do some of the things that we're doing. For example, we have overseas economic interests in Africa and South America. It's one that in order to protect these interests, we will need more naval projection power, and China is doing that. And I think the United States understand it because you have naval bases all over the world. You know the need to protect overseas economic interests or your citizens overseas. So there is legitimate claim behind China's military modernization. And when we view China's military modernization, we should have more empathy to understand if you are China and you have all these overseas interests, what would you do? Wouldn't you want to protect them? Do not always. So the thing to do is do not project like the things China do is always threatening, but try to understand why China is doing that. And if you try to do that, you'll understand there is very good reason that China is doing what we are doing right now.
And with all of this increased military modernization, does that mean that China will also be able to better play a role in regional security, for example, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief?
Yeah, I think China is doing a lot of that right now. We have conducted exercises, military joint disaster relief exercises with Australia, with some other Asia Pacific countries. We are learning many of those experiences from the other countries too, which is good for China and which is good for the other countries to understand China. So this is another area that we could potentially work for, that is to do joint exercises, or at least to invite the other side to observing these exercises, to know that what the real purpose is and how we can share best practices.
I agree. Again, sorry, I mean, maybe this is meant to be controversial, but I actually agree. I think that's it's right to say that China has a legitimate claim in developing its military forces as its economy is growing. I mean, every power has done that. I think that's right. I think, again, the United States is seeking to more explanation and understanding about this seemingly, and I would say, legitimate claim for bigger force. Now, in terms of the nuclear aspect of the modernization, one of the concerns is that, of course, China is expanding and enhancing its nuclear arsenal as the United States and Russia are reducing theirs. Now, of course, and Claudia's mentioned that a few times, and it's true that the U.S. and Russia have significantly larger arsenals than China. At the same time, the lack of transparency is creating concerns, and people have talked about a sprint to parity between, that China would suddenly increase its nuclear forces as the United States and China are reducing their own arsenals. So this is creating problems. Hence the need for China to come forward and be a bit more transparent about what it's doing and why it's doing it.
Well, we've got just 2 minutes left in the program, so it did go by very quickly. But Claudia, I wanted to offer you a chance. Did you have any final thoughts, any lasting remarks, or anything that you didn't get a chance to say it and wanted to share about your thoughts on nuclear dynamics in the U.S. and China?
Yes, very quickly though, just a response to David. I understand your these concern about China's transparency, but also we should also see that a lot of what China is doing right now, for example, developing nuclear submarines, developing more mobile missiles and hardening missile silos. These are good things because these increases the survivability of our nuclear arsenal, which means that with the same or just a slightly increased number of our nuclear arsenal, we can have confidence in our credibility. We can have confidence in the credibility of our deterrence instead of increasing the numbers of our arsenals. So when we look at the growing military capabilities, we should always also remember that some of the modernization program is good for bilateral stability as well. Those programs that increases the survivability actually reduces the need for China to increase its numbers of nuclear weapons to respond to missile defense, to conventional guided weapons. So these are good development. We should not just always look at. We cannot just think of like modernization as a growing threat, but think that it can be a good thing as well for the strategic stability between U.S. and China.
Did you want to quickly respond?
No, I was going to say I agree. I mean, potentially this is right, but again, this needs to be talked. We need to talk about it. We need to have official discussions to discuss this and make sure that indeed this is enhancing crisis and arms control stability.
All right.
Arms race stability. I'm sorry.
Well, this has been an extremely enlightening program. It's been one of the most informative programs I think I've done since I've been here. And I just wanted to, again, extend my thanks to Claudia He, who called in from Washington, D.C. Claudia, we're so grateful that you called in and for sharing your expertise and your perspective. That was really fantastic. And Dr. David Santoro for joining us in studio. Again, great discussion.
Thank you.
For all of
Thank
us
you very
at
much.
ThinkTech Hawaii, thank you for joining us for Asia in Review, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Claudia, you did wonderfully. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives